Hello, this week's topic is on hipsters, bogans, and class, or why your coffee and clothes classify you, but those classifications are usually stereotypes. So this week I'm looking at research that I've done that was published in a book called Youth, Class and Everyday Struggles. And I'll be going through it in three parts as usual. First part, just a broad kind of survey of the idea of hipsters and bogans and the ideas of those as figures and how it fits into broader youth studies research. Then I'll focus on particular empirical examinations of the way that these figures appear in comedy and news, and then conclude by doing some analysis of these things through the lens of Bourdieu's notion of classification struggles. So, part one. So just to kind of situate this, what I'm about to do in, the youth studies field, the study of youth cultures has kind of had a bit of a fluctuating relationship to notions of class. Certainly the idea of subculture, both from the early Chicago school and to the Birmingham school versions of it and in today, class was a key way of thinking about that term, that concept. Particularly the CCS, the Birmingham school, the CCCS, saw much of the kind of subcultures, such as punk and mods and rockers and stuff like that as kind of working class men rebelling against kind of middle class normative traditional cultures. So it's been at the heart of those kind of analysis a lot. More recent times, there's been critique of the kind of using class as the central orientation of thinking about those subcultures, particularly, through gender and race critique, but also in terms of the way that maybe these things called subcultures don't actually map onto classes that well. The example I use all the time is like, in that UK punk scene, people like Susie Sue from the Banshees and Joe Strummer from the Clash were kind of middle-class art students. So, whether we can kind of then claim they're working class and that kind of thing, there's kind of a bit of a blurriness going on in that sense. So there's been critique more recently around the notions of neo-tribes and lifestyles and stuff like that. It kind of points out that most young people, when they do their youth culture, don't necessarily kind of belong to these kind of specific groups and don't like have a kind of youth cultural, I suppose, identity like that's central to what they do. Not everyone wants to be a punk or a goth or whatever. People tend to do things more broadly than that, even though they still might consume aspects of punk or goth music or whatever. So the other thing I would say is that research on youth culture for a long time, and this is still the case, and I'm not actually saying this is a bad thing, but it often focuses on like people like us. So there was a lot of insider research, and there still is with kind of subcultures. People that are in the subculture or interested in it will do research on it. And that's, it goes back to the Birmingham school. But also, there's a kind of political orientation that this research has done with people that we kind of feel respect for and empathy for and kind of like to see the resistance and kind of like doing research on those resistive practices. Much less so in that sense of kind of more mundane or vulgar end of mainstream practice. So I think, again, in terms of the class relation there, particularly like researchers in this field tend to identify more with kind of leftist politics and maybe working class practices in many senses. There's a kind of been an overlap between those interests. So that's why I think bringing kind of the notion of figures, and I'm using the figures of hipsters and bogans in the following, to think about class, to think about youth cultures, to think about consumption is an interesting and useful way to kind of address some of these issues and problems. So what I do in the following, I use kind of Bourdieu's work, but Bourdieu didn't really use figurative methods, and I kind of bring Bourdieu to kind of think what these figures mean through doing an analysis of how they appear in different forms of media and highlight how they kind of bring forth in people, particularly around debates around these things, the way people write about them, the way people talk about them, the way people use them as pejoratives, as a way of kind of talking about class without really talking about class. So what I'm doing here is kind of use them as effective figures. The hipster and bogan kind of make people think and feel things. As you'll see in the chapter, I use some kind of Borgesian theory to do this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking here to address in a way how class is obviously a very important issue in terms of inequality, but it's largely not spoken about very much in public discourse. And when it is, it tends to be through these other mechanisms, like Hipsters and Bogans, for instance. And I'll talk about some other versions as well. So figures such as Hipsters and Bogan, they're kind of in an effective economy. These things make class because they separate us and unite us. So going back to that classic Borgesian quote, taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. If you call something a bogan, so someone a bogan, that classifies them. But also what you classify as bogan kind of classifies you in some kind of hierarchy of taste as well. When the things you denigrate and the things you kind of like, actually kind of classify you as well. So what they also do, I think, is make kind of class inequality and class denigration sayable. Nobody really wants to kind of overtly denigrate or insult poor people or whatever, but like by using terms like this, you can kind of do it more so around things like tastes and morals and values. So these figures are kind of what I call effective figures, and they provoke a bunch of emotional and kind of taste and moral and ethical responses. So there's some kind of classic hipster imagery that you can look at, and the same with Bogan stuff. I'm not going to kind of dwell on that too much. But in the research that I did a kind of deep dive discursive analysis into how these figures were used in Australian media. So I did I started looking around, and then I decided to focus mostly on kind of news and opinion pieces on the one hand, and then on the other, how they're used in comedy and different aspects of that. So there's a bunch of definitional work goes on, and I suppose in some ways this research is a little bit dated now as well. I was doing this in about 2015 to 2017. The book came out in 2018, I think, maybe 2019. And so like you don't hear about the hipster as much anymore, but it was like everywhere back then. You still hear about the bogan, and I can kind of go into the reasons why about that. But at the time, there wasn't a lot of academic research about the hipster. There's still not heaps, but there's kind of been growing a lot more since I wrote the book. In fact, even at the time I was writing the book, there was kind of opinion pieces about, is the hipster over? Has it already gone? On the other side, there's lots of stuff about the bogan out there. And what's interesting about this is that like the hipster was kind of this global figure. It's used across the world. The bogan's particularly Australian, but there's kind of versions of it all around the world, like the chav in the UK and redneck in the US and all that kind of thing. So there's some gestures there towards some other research you can look at as well that kind of writes about these topics. So what I find here is that there's like a bunch of kind of cultural, tasteful, or sometimes not so tasteful touchstones that are associated with these figures. I'm calling them figures, and that relates back to the work on figures that I was talking about in a previous week. So the bogan tends to kind of like more commercial radio or kind of stuff on Triple J, whereas the hipster kind of likes bands you've never heard of and probably don't even exist yet. I'm not going to go through those whole lists, but again, you can kind of see there's like different kind of orientations towards the hipster kind of figure and the bogan figure about the same kind of forms of consumption. Like so when it comes to drinking, the bogan kind of binges on cheap stuff, where the hipster is more kind of refined and doing boutique wines or like boutique beers or whatever. Again, I'm not going to go into all those kind of examples, but you'll be able to kind of see that for yourself, but you get the idea. So that's about kind of broader cultural touchstones. When it comes to more individual traits, what was interesting is I constantly found how the bogan and hipster were kind of used to kind of pathologize people and describe people's character. So like the bogan is undereducated, the hipster has a uni degree. It goes through this kind of stuff, but like particularly bogans are seen as aggressive and more masculine. The hipster's kind of more caring and effeminate. There's like the bogan doesn't kind of care about politics or has a kind of reactionary right-wing kind of politics. The hipster is seen to be more left, but really doesn't care that much about issues and more about presenting that they care about issues. There's kind of the bogan has really conspicuous kind of vulgar tastes. The hipster has more authentic tastes, all this kind of stuff. So again, there's a kind of what happens in some of this writing is implicitly is there's this kind of almost character sketch going on about like who and what these people are. And what I find interesting about this is, I suppose, and I use this example a lot, is that I've been called both of those things by different groups of friends over the years. So this kind of back, before I started doing research, sparked my interest in this because I'm interested in class, I'm interested in material inequalities, and I'm interested in attitudes around and tastes around class as well. So, yeah, played a lot of cricket, and sometimes then I'd be going to see an obscure band and get kind of called like something like a hipster, and the other way around, go and see a band, say I can't come and see a band next weekend because I'm playing cricket, get told that playing cricket's for bogans. So what I'm kind of trying to point out there is that in the end, deep down, I don't think there's such thing as a bogan or a hipster. They're just kind of labels that we attach to things and people and tastes or whatever. Um, and again, we do that in relation to kind of saying something and positioning ourselves in the world as much as what we're doing in terms of labeling others. In terms of all those kind of things that I just pointed out, the different tastes and all that kind of stuff, people can have a mix of those things. It's rare that a person will just kind of have like bogan tastes or hipster tastes to, again, overgeneralize. So what I'm kind of pointing out here is that what these things do in a way is they're kind of floating signifiers to it that allows us to attach our class anxieties upon to attach anxieties about morals and tastes, attach our anxieties about like way money is spent in public or the way, unfairness is kind of intrinsic in the labor market. There's particularly as the work of Barbara Pinney shows, there's a lot of kind of middle class denigration of the so-called cashed up bogan. It seems to kind of have this weird jealousy, for instance, that these uneducated miners can earn like 200-300 grand a year. And like, I've done this uni degree and can't get a full-time job. Everything's precarious. It's not fair. Again, the class kind of who's higher and who's lower in that is kind of blurry in many ways. It relates to economic capital, cultural capital, social capital. It's just kind of sticking people in these boxes. It's more about the relations that these things engender. Okay, I'll leave the first section there and I'll come back and talk more specifically about some of the empirical findings.